So I think we'll make a start. I'm Ros Gleadow and I'm president of the Global Plant Council. I'm from Australia. I was actually in Europe for other reasons as well, so I haven't just come for this workshop. Nevertheless, I'm excited about this workshop because I chair the DSI, or Digital Sequence Information Working Group for the Global Plant Council, and actually I feel really confused about what's going on. There's all these acronyms and there's all these different protocols and different countries approach it the same way, different ways. And so it was together with some sponsorship from Frontiers in Plant Science, and I want to acknowledge them. It's great pleasure that I want to introduce our speaker, Rodrigo Sara. So he's down the front, he'll come up in a minute. Rodrigo actually originally studied in biology and law at the University of Queensland, and then went on and got involved in IP law. He's now a commercial IP lawyer and tech transfer specialist based in Montpellier, among other things, working for CGIARs and so on. And he's supporting responsible bioinnovation and sustainable development. He's had 15 years experience in this area. He spent his first 5 years in a private legal practice, commercial in-house roles, and then transitioning to work in the last 10 years with international research organisations. And many of us are in that situation where we're either in those international research organisations or we're collaborating with them. And it's really important that we know the rules. So one of the things that we're doing with the Global Plant Council is we're trying to gather this information, and we want to produce a working paper that can be useful for people. And this workshop is part of that, plus the workshop we're going to run in Montpellier next month. Rodrigo's worked as an in-house lawyer and consultant focusing on food security and sustainable development. He recently spent a year working with the Convention on Biological Diversity as their DSI consultant, so he comes well qualified for this, and is currently transitioning to an in-house role focusing on equitable access to medical technologies. Now, plant scientists, I wrote a blog recently with a lawyer and a professor of crop science from UQ on the through the Global Plant Council, called Plant Scientists Need to Urgently Reconcile Their Open Access Needs with the Benefit Sharing Rights Associated with Plant Material. And there's a copy of that on the website. It's complicated. We need to reconcile this. If we don't come up with some solutions ourselves, the lawyers will impose them on us, and, you know, goodness knows, help us if that's the case. So I'd like to just pass over to a lawyer, but also a biochemist, Rodrigo, and he's going to take us through and explain what's going to happen in this workshop. So thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction. We're a small group, so hopefully that will facilitate interaction. Feel free to raise your hands if you have questions. I appreciate it's the end of the day, so I've tried to set things up so that the first half of the workshop is, it's a little bit boring, me talking at you, but hopefully navigating through these choppy waters of DSI and ABS, trying to get everybody up to speed and on the same page, so that then we're able to get to the interesting topics and work through them together. And in particular, it's a two-way learning because to really understand the impact of the Nagoya Protocol and the potential regulation of DSI on Arabidopsis research, I'll need your input, because it's not an area that I'm as familiar with as you are, steeped in these issues. So let's dive in. And yeah, so about 40 minutes, and what I'm hoping is just to set the scene, to walk you through the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, so you have a solid foundation before we dive into this DSI-ABS policy debate. And in particular, the Conference of the Parties, 15th Conference of the Parties coming up later this year, which is where this issue of DSI and access and benefit sharing will really come to a head. And we won't go into, we won't have a deep dive, but it's important to understand that there are different policy options, different solutions on the table that will be negotiated at COP15. And I guess the legal scientific interface can be, dry and boring, but the science policy interface is actually fascinating. This is one of those rare areas where you're seeing in real time treaties that have been established and took a lot of effort to set up, buckling under the weight of technological change, and out of that could be something incredible and new, and what we're experiencing right now has been described by some as the Paris moment for biodiversity, and this DSI issue is really going to make or break, and we could, if everything goes to plan, there will be a Paris moment, but that's by no means certain, and it could actually all collapse, and that would be a great travesty to actually have to wait another 5 or 10 years for something to emerge that's fit for purpose. So that's the scene setting, and what I'm hoping is that will then set us up to have a better discussion in our interactive components around what's at stake, these different policy options, what's the best outcome, what's the worst outcome, what's an outcome that is just, it's a deal but it's not a good deal. Then what are the implications for open access? As scientists, I think that's what brought you to this room. Most of you are working in data-heavy research context. Bioinformatics has become an ever-increasing component of the work that researchers are doing. So what if suddenly that entire field was to be put under red tape, and the tools and databases that you're used to using suddenly weren't to be available? It'd be a horrible experiment to have to experience in real time. So, and then lastly, just to also look at, there seems to be a bit of cognitive dissonance going on. We have, there are more parties to UNESCO than there are to the Convention on Biological Diversity. But not by much. They both have quite significant representation and overlap. And yet, on the one hand, you have the international community promoting open science and innovation, and on the other hand, the same countries going into ABS and policy discussions saying, hold on, this is sovereign, these are sovereign issues and we want to control and regulate. So what's going on? And so hopefully we can get to those more exciting topics. In the interactive discussion, we will look at the applicability of the CBD and the Nagoya protocol to our Arabidopsis research, and also try to dig a little bit at this research life cycle. I mean, what's always interesting for me is how closely scientists are to products and commercialization. And what I took from having a look at the program, and also having a walk yesterday and having a look at the posters, is that there's a lot of quite upstream research. And so for a lot of researchers, this may seem abstract. Not necessarily the consequences of a bad deal is very present, because you're using those databases that could be affected. But the whole concept of benefit sharing, maybe that doesn't apply to me because I'm not really involved in product development or commercialization, and hopefully by better understanding those linkages, we'll see that they're two sides of the same coin. So, and then finally, we have a bit more of still an open discussion. It will be led by Ross, and it will really focus on your questions and needs. And here, these are just some, I will suggest some topics if we're finding it that we don't have a lot of questions. But what can the scientific, irrespective of what the laws and regulations say, what can the scientific community be doing? So you don't go and get ethical consent from your research subjects because the law tells you to. You do it because it's good scientific practice. And this is a similar area where perhaps some of that, that regulatory burden that you carry and as scientists, and think, well, why is it so difficult to send seed or biological samples around the world when it used to be so easy? And maybe putting it in context will create an appreciation for treating this similar to how you treat prior informed consent, and coming at it from ethical scientific best practice. And then finally, what cost would the scientific community be willing to pay? But before we start, before we start diving in, I'll just start with the take-home messages so that we don't lose our place, because there's a lot of content to get through. But we see that there's a scientific trend towards open, and at the same time, another trend towards responsible innovation. And these two trends are not always aligned. There are areas of conflict, and that's okay. The ABS framework, when we look at the historical context, it was really born out of the international community agreeing that it was necessary to give countries these sovereign rights to enhance their economic opportunities and development. So that's often lost in the discussion when you're just looking at the permits and the paper trail that you're encountering on your day-to-day basis. The other is that it's later this year, this COP15 event will occur, and there is perhaps some of it's not limited understanding, but I would have expected the scientific community to be much more up in arms, much more coordinated in their messaging, and there seems to be a real gulf between the policymakers and their understanding of scientific research and the scientists and their understanding of the policy implications. So there really needs to be a bridge, and hopefully there's still time for that bridge building and for the scientific community to really, in unison, convey clear messages to policymakers and the international community. And then finally, what's at stake? What can we do to prevent the worst case scenario? And for those of you... Sure. Yeah, okay, that's louder. Okay, so for those that are not familiar, so we can't talk about DSI without talking about the Nagoya Protocol. We can't talk about the Nagoya Protocol without talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the birthing of that convention was not in isolation. It was part of this Rio Earth Summit in the 90s. And this is a period of intense multilateralism. The international community is coming together and putting in place the treaties that would go on to regulate climate change, anti-desertification, biodiversity conservation, etc. It was a really exciting time for multilateralism. And the approach that was adopted was a seismic shift. Prior to this Convention on Biological Diversity being approved, the genetic resources of the world were seen as a type of global commons, which is intuitive, whereas putting the genetic resources of the world under the control of individual governments seems counterintuitive. But at the time, it was really part of a grand bargain struck between those countries that tend to provide genetic resources, which tend to be in the south, and those countries which tend to use genetic resources, which tend to be in the north. And the real objective was putting this under the purview of sovereign governments so that they could exploit, so that they could benefit from the economic opportunities that those genetic resources provided, and then be responsible stewards of conservation and the sustainable use of those biodiversity resources. So that's the context in which this convention was first emerged. And we see it currently has 196 parties, so a significant chunk of the governments of the world have signed up. And it has three objectives. It's the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, alongside the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits resulting from the utilization of genetic resources, which is often abbreviated to ABS. And it laid a framework that was quite important, but not complete enough to really be implementable. It lacked, as we'll see, clarity, substance, so as to be implemented in a uniform way. And that's what led to, 8 years later, the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. Of the treaty being signed 8 years later and then coming into effect once the threshold number of countries had signed in 2014. And this protocol really zooms into fair and equitable sharing of benefits and how that's regulated. And so its key objective is fair and equitable benefit sharing arising from the utilization of genetic resources in research and innovation. But it also focuses on appropriate access to genetic resources and appropriate transfer of relevant technologies. And that last one is quite important to revisit and remember, because it's often lost in the discussion, where the discussion seems to focus simply on accessing genetic resources and how easy that should be. And sometimes what's lost is, well, what about those technologies that are produced as a result of that access? And what about transferring those technologies? So access for access, I think, would have been a fairer deal. And I think what the international community is calling for is, yes, access to genetic resources in exchange for access to products and innovations. So that's the that's the context. We've had a look at the objectives of both. When you dive in, I've just tried to tease out some of the provisions. We won't go into detail in the actual treaty provisions, but just so that you can see that the ABS elements, the access and benefit sharing elements in each of these different instruments are borne out by articles which focus on cooperation, on research and training, on public education and awareness, on the exchange of information, on technical and scientific communication. So other things than simply access and benefit sharing. And it's important to look at that broader context. And likewise, in the Nagoya Protocol, many more provisions giving context and framing to access and benefit sharing. So looking at transboundary cooperation, looking at codes of conducts, guidelines, and best practices, looking at capacity, looking at technology transfer, collaboration, and cooperation. And so some of the tensions that we're currently experiencing in this space, perhaps we don't need a whole new international treaty. Perhaps the solutions are already built in the existing regulatory framework, and we have certain provisions, certain mechanisms that are simply underused, understaffed, under-resourced. So just some food for thought. But so the Convention on Biological Diversity, it actually did not define key concepts. It doesn't explain, it has no definition for access, for prior informed consent, for mutually agreed terms, or for benefit sharing. Then Nagoya comes along and gives more legal certainty to these by way of definition. But as we've seen in the last almost 10 years now of implementation since it became effective, there's still regulatory uncertainty and legal ambiguity when it comes to national implementation. And so that's the DSI comes in an inopportune time because it comes on top of the tensions and the complexity that already existed. And we see that for those 132 countries that have implemented or that have ratified the Nagoya Protocol, they have a commitment to actually implement through their national laws. And so there is a proliferation of definitions that might differ from the definitions used in the treaty, and proliferation of national frameworks that are similar yet different. And that makes it a very difficult regulatory environment for researchers. So we see in the Nagoya Protocol to implement the sovereign rights that countries have to really control access. We see to their genetic resources, we see the emergence of a bilateral approach. So it's really on a case-by-case basis. You want to access genetic resources, you apply, each country will have a different procedure for permits, and then for negotiating mutually agreed terms and conditions. Then, likewise, so for negotiating prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms. Then we see that also national laws will vary in terms of how they address scope. So in terms of temporal scope, from what point do they require users to actually be in compliance? And we see some countries exploring the possibility of retroactive application of their national laws, whereas other countries treat it as only coming into place as from when either the Convention on Biological Diversity came into effect, or the Nagoya Protocol came into effect, or national law came into effect. But you get some tricky questions, right? What if your institute accessed genetic resources before these regulatory frameworks were in place, but you're using them now for a different purpose? So it's a new utilization. Shouldn't that perhaps mean that that use is subject to the current regulatory frameworks? So these are tricky legal questions we won't get into, but just worth putting on your radar that they're questions that keep the lawyers at your institutes up at night, and when you come to them with these kinds of issues, they're the questions that they're asking to figure out, do you as a researcher have, and does the institute have freedom to operate? Can we comfortably do this research and not be in violation, or are there regulatory requirements that we have to actually adhere to and apply approvals for? So we see this difference in not just national, but also regional implementation. So the EU tends to take a unified approach, but not uniform. Not every country in the EU. Some countries in the EU actually do have laws that regulate their access to their genetic resources, whereas for the most part, as far as the EU regulation is concerned, they They don't have a mechanism for granting prior informed consent, but they do require researchers to be compliant with the ABS laws of other countries. So for genetic resources accessed beyond their territories. And that sounds straightforward, but what happens when you have materials in your collection that have come from other countries? So again, regulatory and legal complexity that we won't get into, but just showing how this proliferation of national and regional systems can create a very tricky environment to operate in. Then, before we do actually move on, I'm curious to know, so what encounter you as researchers, if at all, have had with ABS frameworks, and just 2 to 5 minutes, just to, feel free to raise your hand or speak out. Is this area completely in a blind spot for you in terms of your research? Is it actually something that you've encountered, either directly in your research or the research project that you're working in? Is it something that you're encountering regularly and have actually had to deal with some substantive issues and seek legal internal support or external support to address? So just to give me a sense of where we are in the room. So if you've had no real exposure to ABS issues or accessing materials under national ABS laws, just a raising of hands. Okay, and then some exposure, maybe your project or a researcher in your lab has had to deal with these. Okay, and then what about you yourself? Your research directly requires approvals, and you've had to jump through the hurdles and become an overnight expert in these regulatory matters. Okay, so we actually have a mix, which is great. And in that context, has anyone actually been involved in negotiations for mutually agreed terms?
Is this for digital sequence?
This is in general under ABS. So typically we're talking about accessing materials, and you're negotiating mutually agreed terms to use those materials. Some countries do also have their national laws apply to digital sequence information, but that at the moment that is a minority. But I guess one of the scenarios that could emerge from the negotiations underway is that all DSI might be locked up or have some friction associated with accessing it. So I suspect that few would have had experience in a DSI context having to negotiate ABS, but that's today. That might not be the case tomorrow. Okay, so nobody, and that's fine. That's.
Sorry, I've got, yeah. So I'm Jared, I'm an editor at Cell Press, and I'm probably coming from the other side of this, where we have active discussions for how researchers need to report this information in the papers that are published in our portfolio. And my colleagues think very carefully about how all of this is done and what the requirements are towards ensuring that the authors on the paper do go out and are compelled to share sequence information or plant varieties or plant uses and things like that. Is this within the context?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one important thing to note there is that one of the discussions that has been unfolding now for some years is in the patent system is whether which with a link to ABS issues, is whether national patent systems should have an obligation for patent applicants to disclose country of origin, where genetic resources have been used or play a material role in an invention for which a patent protection is claimed. And that's an argument that's been ongoing for quite some time now under the World Intellectual Property Organization. But what I've started to see in recent years is that same question around is there an obligation, should there be an obligation to disclose origin of genetic resources, is moving into the journals. And whether articles are accepted for publication or peer review and publication. And then different journals are taking a different stand in terms of the extent to which they have due diligence requirements or disclosure requirements. And so these issues are all interconnected.
I can also say, so we're kind of on a different part of the triangle.
users asking the publisher.
Yeah, no, us, we're a biobank, so we distribute.
Sorry, the biobank, right.
So therefore the answer is
Right.
it's what's the due diligence. So we have our own regulations in terms of Nagoya, in terms of being a biobank, but then there's the users who have asked us about their responsibility through us, the due diligence of tracking where the original materials have come from.
Yeah, and that's going to be pretty tricky because, yeah.
Well, for us, it's okay because all we have to do is have the information available. That's our own responsibility.
Yeah.
But for them, they have to then find out if there's any people associated with the origin of the seeds. And luckily for Arabidopsis, that's actually quite, at the moment, fairly easy. For the ESI, they're not.
Okay, and then before moving on, just highlighting some resources. So for those that might not be familiar, the Convention on Biological Diversity has an ABS clearinghouse, an access and benefit sharing clearinghouse. So that's a useful port of call if you ever need to figure out, okay, does a particular country that you're thinking about accessing genetic materials from have regulations in place? What are they? So they are a one-stop shop for that, for all ABS-related information provided by governments. And then there's a ton of other resources available depending on your area of research. One that I find particularly useful is the UEBT, the Union for Ethical Biotrade, which is a partnership of sorts, which tends to focus in agriculture but more on the fragrance and flavors side. But they have very good information sheets that are easier to understand, I think, for anybody who's not so familiar in the area, and country-based fact sheets. And so a great way to get in a short amount of time, get your head around what requirements may be in a particular country context. And so, for example, ABS in Madagascar, ABS in Peru, and just as a primer to understand what you might need to know. Okay, and so now we've got the foundation. We get to the interesting part of the discussion, which is the DSI side of things. And it's this question: 30 years later, did this grand bargain work? Are people happy with it? And but there's all sorts of issues I mentioned earlier. Scientists are unhappy because there's too much red tape. Countries that provide genetic resources are unhappy because the bioeconomic opportunity they were expecting has never materialized. The private sector is unhappy because they don't have freedom to operate in many circumstances. So it seems that this framework has been very successful at making everybody unhappy and to a degree miserable. And on top of all that, the actual key driver of the implementation of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol are these 10-year biodiversity plans, the last of which finished in 2020 and was really failed to achieve any of the targets that had been set. So really a dismal outcome if you're measuring the performance of that treaty through at least those indicators. And then on top of all that, all of a sudden, in 2016 or so, comes you start hearing this term, digital sequence information. It's a really, it's an abstract term. What does that actually mean? But it's just adding on top of a system that was straining under the weight. It's adding significant pressure, and you can also understand the context. So before we get into what digital sequence information might be, I'll just give a bit of context, which is, you can imagine in '93, looking at this particular graph, which is the cost per genome. In '93, it starts at 2001, so you can imagine what the cost would have been to sequence back in '93 when the Convention on Biological Diversity was being negotiated. Then in 2010, when the Nagoya Protocol was first approved, you can also see that the cost of sequencing was so high. Yes, the amount of data and information that was out there was significant, but really nowhere near the volumes that we're seeing today at the cost that we're seeing today. And so that's where 2016 or so, people started connecting the dots and saying, well, hold on a second, we have this complex treaty infrastructure to govern access to physical genetic resources, But now we're sequencing everything, and all of that value is just accessible online. I can download it without having to go through any of the permits. And so there seems to be a real failure in the system. There seems to be a real potential for, like a backdoor access to just bypass the system. And that's where these tensions have been arising. And you hear words, you hear biopiracy being bandied around, and obviously no researcher wants to facilitate or be in any way implicated with biopiracy. But that's actually what the tensions around ABS are exactly this. It's saying by sequencing those genomes and putting that information in the public domain without any benefits really flowing back to those countries, it's a type of biopiracy in which we are all complicit. And so, I mean, they're strong words, but that viewpoint, we can't dismiss it just because as a scientific community we do open access and say, well, isn't that, we do open access, that's our responsibility, but does it go far enough is the question. So, and these tensions around digital sequence information, I've pointed to a bomb, I guess, because they really risk blowing up these negotiations. The negotiations are underway to adopt a new strategy for biological conservation, a new global biodiversity framework for the next decade, belatedly because it's 2022, but that strategy has yet to be adopted, and it may actually not be adopted because the tensions around ABS and DSI are so high. And we actually already saw this play out in about 2019 under the Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources, where approximately 9-year process to negotiate to improve and enhance that treaty just crumbled because the issue of DSI just became a sticking point that the international community couldn't arrive at a consensus solution. And so DSI, this abstract term, so sometimes it's called genetic sequence data. For some people, it's much broader than that. And this placeholder term has been adopted. Digital sequence information, it's quite, it doesn't help the gulf that exists between scientists and policymakers when it's not clear what DSI is, and it's not a term that's innately logical or used by the scientific community. Efforts by the Convention on Biological Diversity to commission studies to try and flesh out, what could be the scope of DSI has coalesced based on an ad hoc technical expert group providing recommendations around, I guess, a Russian dolls concept where at a minimum DSI could be just nucleotide sequence data. At the next broader scope iteration, it could also include protein data from transcription and translation. It could also involve metabolic data. It could also involve, in the broader sense, subsidiary information related to the omics data. So and one of the issues that needs to be settled by the international community is what exactly is DSI, because any regulatory friction that you place will then potentially impact either a small subset of data or a much larger set of data, and by implication, either a small subset of databases or a much broader set of databases. So that's still out, but at a minimum, it's certainly the data that is in the nucleotide sequence data that's in the INSDC constitutive databases. So that much we know. And so as mentioned, this issue is really coming to a head. Will we have the Paris moment for biodiversity? It's at this stage, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you'd think that the 2 extra years to actually negotiate would have helped resolve the tensions, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that positions are really entrenched, and no amount of fact-finding studies has necessarily changed national government positions on this DSI issue. But what's really important is that there is an adoption of the next 10-year global biodiversity framework, and coupled with that is a 10-year strategy. This is quite a new approach for the CBD, but it's a 10-year strategy on capacity development to support the implementation of that GBF. So, you know, those are the elements at stake if we can't arrive at consensus on this particular issue. And we, as of yesterday, actually now we have a date of that meeting. COP15 will now take place in December, and it will still be coordinated by China, but it will take place in Montreal, Canada. And, you know, we see this issue playing out in a number of different fora. So I mentioned earlier the International Plant Treaty, where this issue really exploded. Also in negotiations underway for an international treaty on marine biological diversity for areas beyond national jurisdiction, so high waters. Also under WIPO, I mentioned earlier some of the issues they're looking at around disclosure of genetic resources origins, and that's taking place particularly in their Intergovernmental Committee on IP and Genetic Resources, as well as traditional knowledge. So quite a few different fora dealing with this issue, and unfortunately, potentially, each one could come up with a different solution, which is hopefully not the case, but you know, for scientists that are working in a cross-disciplinary environment, you know, at the border of these treaties, there is the potential that there could be different frameworks governing different resources that they use, which would be a terrible outcome. And I mentioned the policy options or solutions that are being considered. So there's technically 5 options, but there are subcategories, which makes it 7. And then an additional option has been put on the table. So there's, you know, about 8. We won't get into the options. We just don't have time. They're complex. But it's useful knowing that for our purposes that, you know, some of these options are bilateral. So as per the Nagoya Protocol, and requiring approval and permits on a case-by-case basis, whereas others are multilateral. Other options on the table are multilateral, which potentially are a better fit for science and open access, because they would that multilateralism would be better aligned with research and innovation. But these and one of the options on the table is a global biodiversity tax, which is actually, when I first heard it, I thought, this is great. It's really innovative. It has the potential to raise, even a very small percentage could raise, you know, trillions of dollars or billions of dollars from trillions of dollars of biodiversity-based products, and that could do a lot to bridge the funding gap that exists in biodiversity conservation. But when you get into the details, what's being proposed is actually quite complex. You know, this global framework would only apply in certain circumstances where bilateral systems are difficult to implement or not practicable. So in the end, you actually end up with yet another layer of complexity. So the way that global biodiversity tax is being described might not be the panacea that we as a research community would want. Then we get to, well, what does it mean for research? And we can already see that this kind of bilateral approach to regulating data and databases could have huge implications for open access. And so all of the value that we attribute to open access, you know, and a significant amount of value is specifically for the research community, citations, knowledge transfer, etc. But there's a broader set of societal benefits that are at risk as well. And what's at stake is that the 40-year history, right? It's taken 40 years to get to where we are today in terms of open access increasingly being becoming a systemized approach by institutions, by journals, by governments, and that's at risk of being undone or being severely impaired. And so what we have now, it's actually several lineages. It's open sequence data. It's an open sequence data movement commencing in the 80s, kind of joining up with the open software, open source software movement, joining up with the very fragmented open access publishing environment, and all converging on this modern umbrella of open science, which is still a diffuse concept, but certainly open science would appear to be vastly in conflict with a bilateral approach to accessing data and databases. And we see that as a result of, because we've had these 30 years of building the infrastructure that underpins open science, we've become used to data being open, interconnected, and interdependent. And here we've just got some diagrams that show the relationship of data flows through different databases and how interconnected and interdependent the life sciences data ecosystem is. And it raises questions. Could we actually have responded to COVID-19 with the speed with which we did as overall, without this DSI data commons actually being in place? I mean, putting aside the other very serious issues around vaccine inequity and manufacturing constraints, but would we be shooting ourselves in the foot by moving away from this commons approach that has seemed to have worked well in certain respects over the last 30 years, 40 years. And here you will, I'm sure, hopefully be familiar with some of these milestones. So the actual setting up of the INSDC databases that feed the data through the life sciences, the adoption of Bermuda Principles and several statements, focusing on open access publishing, more recently going beyond open access publishing and really focusing on open data and the elements that underpin open data, culminating with the Fair Data Principles in 2016 and more recently the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation, which for younger researchers, it may only be these last two that are squarely on their radar. But what characterizes this ecosystem is really interoperability and frictionless use. There's no need to register to access data. There's no discrimination between users. There's no purpose discrimination, whether you're using for a commercial purpose or whether you're using for a research purpose. And it's available to users in any country. So there's no jurisdiction shopping at present or need for tracking and tracing. So these are the underlying features that we've come to take for granted, and there is a possibility that a framework rolled out could come into conflict with these core principles if it's not implemented appropriately, and the unintended consequences that could then have for science and innovation. So we can move on to look at what can the scientific community do to help resolve these tensions. And so at the institutional level, we see organizations moving beyond just open access as a mantra and starting to distinguish between the need for open access to research results while at the same time ensuring equitable access to innovations and products. And here, hopefully you're all familiar to some degree with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the constraints that exist. So that vaccine has been produced and distributed around the world on a no-cost basis for the duration of the pandemic, and I think the trigger is as called by the WHO. So that didn't spontaneously happen. That didn't happen spontaneously. It happened because institutional policies required their researchers, when collaborating with the private sector or transferring technology to the private sector, to say, hey, you want the IP? No problem, but it comes with strings attached. And so they're really sophisticated mechanisms to ensure that the private sector and the public sector and non-profit sector are really aligned, particularly around emergencies. And we saw some success in those policies coming into play with COVID, and now we're facing a food security emergency, and the question is what mechanisms are in place, what institutional policies are out there that are helping increase the alignment between the public sector and the private sector. You might also be familiar with the COVAX mechanism, which was a mechanism to distribute vaccines to developing countries. And so it doesn't get over the manufacturing constraints and issues that are experienced, but at least there's now trying to address supply constraints. And so really innovative approaches that exist. Some of you may be familiar with the CGIAR, and they 10 years ago, actually adopted a policy not focused on maximizing just access, but focused on maximizing access and impact. So inherently recognizes a trade-off between the two, and that sometimes temporary exclusivity might be needed to achieve greater impact. And they, the strings attached that they have is that any exclusivity granted comes with carve-outs. So for research use by non-commercial organizations and for food security emergencies. So hopefully that's where institutional policies are going, beyond just an open access mantra. And just mindful of time. Okay, so additionally, your research projects. And so here, again, this is where we go beyond. It's not, forget about necessarily what the regulations say and what in a particular country. It's, as a researcher, how can you be designing projects that bootstrap benefit sharing? And particularly the area of benefit sharing that's most immediately within your control, which is non-monetary benefit sharing, which is making sure that there's real technical cooperation, that countries where genetic resources have actually come from are involved in your research projects, that you're building the capacity of the researchers of those countries, that you're facilitating the flow of equipment to, using your research projects to facilitate the flow of equipment to those countries, etc. So quite a bit that so maybe not so much that you can do at the institutional level, but a lot that you can do in your research projects, and particularly those when you're partnering with the private sector around, using IP ownership and licensing as the vehicle, as the Trojan horse of sorts, to actually get these responsible commitments folded into the technology you're handing over. And so similarly, we don't need to go through them, but in 2020, this expert technical advisory group highlighted some key areas around DSI, and what we will hopefully see is that this 10-year long-term strategy for capacity development will also directly address digital sequence information, and particularly building capacity around molecular biology applications, around DSI processing, around bioinformatics, around database management. It's not just accessing that data, but having the capacity to analyze, process, and add value to that data. So, these are things that the RTEG has identified, but these are also things that you could be building into your projects on a more immediate, short-term basis. And similarly, lots of different modalities. So, and some of these that you do already. Many of you are already involved in courses and workshops, in joint scientific research, in co-authored journal articles with other institutes. So, a lot of this is actually instinctive, and you're doing already. You might just not be thinking about it through an ABS lens and quantifying it and communicating about it through an ABS lens. But if you're not measuring it and communicating about it, it's almost as if it's not happening. And so it's a bit of a shame when I see these international debates, and there's a lack of quantified data to be able to say, well, open access, there are benefits associated with open access, and look, we can point to these concrete outcomes. And so the research community is starting to find the right metrics to communicate that message in a consistent way will be really important. Then, in terms of how you can get involved, there's quite a few initiatives out there. Some of you might be familiar with the DSI Scientific Network, which is open for any researchers to join, and their focus is amplifying scientific perspectives into policy discussions. And they released an open letter last year calling on policymakers to make sure that researchers are given a voice, to listen to the scientific community in these international deliberations, to make sure that any outcomes, when we look at those several policy solutions and mention that some of them just do not seem fit for purpose from a scientific and research perspective. So making sure that those options are discarded if those options which are unworkable with how scientific research and innovation is performed are not on the table. and priority is given to those options which do achieve benefit sharing, but in a way that least minimizes open access or least disrupts research and innovation. And then finally, to actually learn from the experience of the Nagoya Protocol, which in, I don't think I've ever met anybody who said that it's a success, because all users are upset to a degree. So, let's not reinvent the bilateral wheel. We've had experience. We've had now 10 years of experience of bilateral systems that just don't achieve what they were set out to achieve. And likewise, there are other working groups. So the Global Plant Council itself has a working group focusing on DSI. They are they have some interesting activities and products that are in the pipeline for this year, and I'll let Roz elaborate on those a little bit more. ICAR is a member, so all ICAR participants should be able to participate in some way in the working group, but I'll let Roz clarify that. And similarly, Frontiers in Plant Science is for those who want to dig a little bit deeper and actually find out more from a resource that you might be familiar with. In 2020, they released a research topic compiling 14 articles, really looking at operational issues, regulatory issues related to plant genetic resources, and quite a few articles do a deep dive in a plant breeding context on ABS issues. And so just highlighting for your attention, already about 100,000 scientists have gone in and downloaded this research topic, so maybe you're already one of them. But I think you'll probably find that hearing about ABS issues from those in your community are probably going to make it a lot more accessible than having a lawyer or a tech transfer specialist try to break down those issues for you. Then, unfortunately, we've been talking about ABS, but actually there's, it's just indicative of what's happening with research and innovation. It's increasingly regulated, and we see this trend. I, working with a couple of other researchers at the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, finished a study last year commissioned by the Convention on Biological Diversity, focusing on synthetic biology so firstly looking at the actual technologies that make up synthetic biology, and then looking at the regulatory landscape and what international treaties may affect those technologies. And we found 20-odd different treaties that have implications. And obviously synthetic biology is quite a diffuse concept, but certainly many of you are using biotechnology approaches and techniques that may be spilling over into synthetic biology. So just, ABS is just one issue in a whole ecosystem of complex regulatory issues. Then what I had wanted to do, but not needing to go into a huge amount of detail, it's this really, there seems to be a distinction between scientists working in academia and researchers and scientists working often, and I could be wrong, it might be different at your institute, but I tend to see those scientists and researchers working in industry, really seeing themselves as part of a product life cycle, and researchers working in academia seeing themselves more as part of a research life cycle, and the two being almost distinct, and as if they were distinct value chains. And they are very distinct in terms of their motives, right? So if you're in academia, your focus is really scientific knowledge transfer and exchange. Open access plays a big part, and if you're in industry, it's more commercialization and profit as the key objective. But there's actually quite a bit of interplay between those. These are two sides of the same coin. There's the research that you're doing then is, it's the foundation on which industry is then picking up the bits that have commercial application and taking them to market. So the publishing of information and the discovery and impact that comes out of the research, upstream research lifecycle, really feeds into the product lifecycle. And so it's really part of the same value chain, and this is really important from an ABS perspective, because the due diligence for Nagoya happens upstream. It's when you're planning and implementing your research projects. And if you haven't thought about benefit sharing at that stage, then how possibly could there be benefit sharing at the very end when the product comes out of the downstream product life cycle? So there is a real important relationship between the two. And yes, open access is important, but that's not where the buck stops. It's open access, and what more? How can we ensure equitable access to the resulting technologies? So open access is the responsibility of the upstream research sector, but because they're doing the Nagoya Protocol due diligence, it's on them to impose the benefit sharing obligations that then bind the downstream private sector. So, it's an oversimplification, but there is really a connection between these two, and that connection actually is most prominent through the databases. So the information, the databases that are being used to put all of this sequence data and analysis and metabolic pathways in the public domain are the very tools that are being accused as facilitating biopiracy. So it's the most sensitive, the strongest linkage is also the most sensitive in this ABS discussion. Then, and with a big thanks to Javier Brumos and also Isabel, when I was asked to present, I had a look at the initial program for Arabidopsis research. I had a chat with Javier, and I was like trying to understand how could I do a workshop when so much of the research seemed to be upstream and probably wasn't being captured, probably didn't involve, you're working with model organisms, so are you actually encountering the Nagoya Protocol or the Convention on Biological Diversity in your everyday research? And thankfully, Javier walked me through the program and really helped me, and he identified, researchers and topics that show that actually, yes, you're doing research in model organisms, but there's lots of linkages and spillover into commercial applications for crops involving, for example, rice. Cassava was also mentioned, and potatoes. And so quite a lot of this upstream research in Arabidopsis does seem to have linkages and implications for downstream commercial products, even though those linkages may be a 20-year product development life cycle before those technologies reach the market. But they will, those traits that you're identifying now may be the traits that are optimized and go to market 10 to 20 years from now to combat climate change, to combat desertification, etc. So there is a strong relevance to the research program. Then we move in. So that's the me talking at you part. So thanks for your patience. And now we move into your impressions. And so firstly, and I may have given it away, but the question as to whether utilization of, so we've navigated the Nagoya Protocol and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and so is your Arabidopsis research within the scope of these treaties? And we've had at least one researcher explain that they have.
Well, in terms of ours, the advice we tend to give is that most of the Arabidopsis accessions were taken from the wild for the cut-off date, and obviously in the UK, the cut-off implementation is a year later as well. So the biggest worry we've got is in terms of digital sequence information, not so much access to sequences from other organisms that are newly sequenced, but perhaps transgenics, where you've moved material from an organism into Arabidopsis. So that is a serious, sorry, yes. So the concept of using transgenics is really critical, not necessarily, as we're saying, going off to crops and doing research on Arabidopsis and passing on to crops, but taking that material from other species and bringing it into Arabidopsis. And the other thing is that my understanding was that it was going to be built on top of Nagoya, so it's an extension of Nagoya. And Nagoya has explicit exclusions in terms of anti-PTRFA for annex crops. So will they still be excluded? And also in terms of infectious diseases are excluded, so human sequence. So there are existing exclusions for Nagoya that happen already, but is this going to change with sequence information?
That's the million-dollar question. That there are these. So you've got the convention, and then you've got carve-outs for health, for for the 64 crops or so of the plant treaty. But each one of these fora are looking at DSI through their own lens, and there's no guarantee that they will come together and all land on the same policy solution, right? There may be different approaches, and that for researchers that work at an interface, so if you're working on rice, and rice is one of the crops that is governed under the international treaty, plant treaty, but only by certain countries. And so if you're using, if you're accessing databases and using sequence data, does that mean you need to check which country that rice data may have come from, whether they're a member to which protocol? It becomes incredibly confusing and challenging, and the real risk is it actually, the unintended consequence is that it diminishes research because there's no freedom to operate, and so the institutions themselves will start telling researchers what areas may or may not be too risky to actually move forward in.
So, for Arabidopsis, your original comment, a lot of, well, 99% of all the accessions in Arabidopsis have come from the UK, Germany, and the US. So US isn't part of Nagoya, and the UK has said they are not imposing any sovereign rights on any materials. So from that perspective, there is still a question on ecotypes that have been accessed after 2015, but in general, Arabidopsis per se is not relevant to Nagoya.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because when I was looking this up, I thought, well, it's about the relevance, and of course I just used Google, and I came across not Arabidopsis thaliana, but Arabidopsis something or other down in Turkey or somewhere. I mean, Turkey is, obviously part of the group, but there must be Arabidopsis species that are from outside of that region. They will be used in research and comparison. So my understanding is that they would be subject at some stage to this type of thing.
If they're newly collected, so we already have a lot of those in the biobank. So if they've been accessed, or that there was that dangerous comment of is a new use of something that was accessed before that date is new use, new accession. So that is a really interesting point that we've been taking so far, that once they're in a biobank, once they're accessible, that's been accessed, and so therefore new use would not involve a new access, if you like.
Does anyone else hear Catherine?
When I sort of been involved in work on amaranth, which is a traditional crop that isn't on the 64 list, which I didn't realise varied country by country. And it was a few years ago, and it was so confusing, I can't quite remember what the outcome was. But I thought that we've got a collection of amaranth from around the world that has then come through USDA and the World Vegetable Centre. So maybe those are like what Sean was saying. They've already been collected, and so we've sort of signed MTAs, but we haven't had to sort of do any multiple bilateral. But I can see that, so I'm not really saying much, but I can see that this issue of multilateral versus bilateral is just critical. It seems to me that's almost the key point that we should all be getting, behind, in the sense of sort of negotiations about what's included in that multilateral sort of become secondary to the fact that you've got to have something that's multilateral, otherwise it's just going to be unworkable.
The entire rationale for having carve-outs to the sovereign bilateral approach set up under the Convention on Biological Diversity is in areas where it's simply too dangerous to, right, where there's, for example, in agriculture, the flow of genetics is so important to plant breeding, is so important to food security, that we couldn't put that under the control of individual governments, because it would just, the consequences outweigh the benefits. Or the detrimental consequences outweigh the benefits. And it's a similar argument in this DSI space. That there's a strong argument, and this is what the open letter and other efforts by scientific organizations to put forward their views is really to underscore that whatever the system looks like, what's fundamental is that it's multilateral, right? So you know, and back to that question at the very beginning, what cost is the scientific community willing to pay to avoid balkanization, to avoid a regulatory system that is unimplementable, right? And it can't be business as usual, because this whole issue is, you know, it's really come to a head. So what does a compromise look like? And I guess for the scientific community, it's, so what's the price to safeguard multilateralism? And is that agreeing to disclose origin of your genetic resources when you upload information to INSDC databases? Probably as a minimum, you know, but what else on top of that? Is it much more explicitly building technical cooperation, capacity development, you know, non-monetary benefit sharing into your research projects, and having much clearer obligations on the private sector around benefit sharing? Probably. So that trade-off, you know, to preserve open access and to keep a multilateral system for data, right, which wants to be free and will not respond well to a bilateral approach. You know, what of those many options that are being considered, which ones should the scientific community be really advocating for and putting its weight behind, but not in a proactive way, where it's, you know, to make sure that it can retain those models or advance or prioritize those models. You know, what can it add as the sweetener, or what can it compromise on and say, well, these are the things we are willing to do as a research community, or these are the things we're willing to do as the private sector, to avoid regulatory friction around ESI suddenly blowing up these databases that, you know, this infrastructure that's taken 30, 40 years to implement. But yeah, that's the bit that's missing. The scientific community speaking with a uniform voice on not necessarily the policy detail, but the red lines, or what are the things it absolutely wants to preserve. So
I've got some more questions from up here. Anybody got questions they want to ask? So one of the things that made me think of what you were just saying is that back in the 90s, you know, when some of us were actually doing research, we had a big discussion, of course, on all the open software that we were writing. We were writing educational software and software for doing our analysis. You have the same thing now. You have your databases and everything, and it's all open source, you know, open access. And we had a couple of lawyers come along to one of our workshops and said, you know, this is not going to last. In the end, everybody's going to have to pay. You know, you're not going to get this stuff for free. And that is true to a large extent, but not completely. It seems to me there are some parallels there of what's happened in the software industry. Have you got any thoughts about how we could learn from that experience? Because that's actually a mess.
So the software industry is an interesting one, because from where I sit, the open model seems to, it hasn't been wiped out. It seems to be working well. It doesn't, many companies that have proprietary products incorporate open access elements of software into their products. So there seems to be a hybrid approach that coexists well in that particular environment. I'm not sure how easily it's transferable into a life sciences context, but other approaches, so I mean, this issue of someone has to pay somewhere in that value chain. At the moment, it's the scientist, right? The system's failing because it's not producing commercial benefits. It's not resulting in those commercial benefits being shared. And the burden is being imposed really upstream on the researchers to get those permits. And so the question then becomes, could you remove that layer of regulatory burden on upstream on researchers by having enough money coming in, right? That would actually, this whole debate is about inadequate monetary benefits being shared. And so some of the innovative thinking around solutions are, for example, this global tax on biodiversity products. So far, I haven't seen a description of the model that seems workable. Others have proposed a surcharge on reagents used for biotechnology research, right, and what those reagents look like, but somewhere in that value chain, actual money being produced in a way that is acceptable to the countries that are principally the providers of genetic resources that don't feel that the grand bargain is living up to their expectations. So there are lots of models that have been bandied about in terms of even industry-based fees, so that maybe if you're involved in pharmaceutical research and product development, then there are fees that are tied to the profits that industry generates, which are much higher, or that if you're involved in biodiversity conservation, that's not an area that tends to generate significant profit, so that your contributions would not be as significant as, say, somebody in the pharmaceutical sector. So there are models that have been proposed, really focusing on this choke point of a lack of funding flowing through the system, and that would take the pressure off on the need for a bilateral approach and the need for a regulatory approach. And this is just an opinion, but I think what's missing is for the private sector to actually be more engaged in this discussion and to propose models where they are accepting taxes or levies of some description. And we saw that in the negotiations for the plant treaty, they, the private sector wasn't willing to pay a fee under a multilateral model where it would be a simple formula depending on the company and the country. And so the fallback is this bilateral system which doesn't generate benefits but generates a lot of regulatory compliance costs upstream. So yeah, there are certainly models that are being discussed, but none that are really, none of these options have been fleshed out as a model that seems particularly attractive for the research community, just looking at it from a solution that generates some benefits, that keeps the database and open access infrastructure in place, and that has minimal disruption to research and innovation. And so that's also regulatory certainty, etc. So all the criteria of what a perfect system or what a system should look like are there, or the features are there, but no proposal is really on the table that seems to be tying all of these things together at present.
So I was going to, why do you think Nagoya's not working? I mean, is it unrealistic expectations of countries in terms of the sort of scale of bio-based innovation that actually brings benefit, commercial benefit? Or is it that Nagoya has sort of prevented things happening? Or is it that people are just not bothering with it and it's somehow not being protected? Why is it not working?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a fundamental mismatch between how science is done and the expectations of countries of where they'll be able to actually impose obligations for benefits, right? And so I can see how Nagoya would be attractive to countries because it gives them sovereign control, and any multilateral system would mean that they get a fraction of maybe what's missing is economic theorists to actually do the modeling and show that under a bilateral system, some people describe it as a race to the bottom, right? Because it's your ability to attract access to your resources at the expense of, right, because you're able to offer more favorable terms, like no benefit sharing at all, for example, versus a multilateral system that takes away your sovereignty, and also maybe a fundamental miscalculation that governments that the private sector would be so interested that they would be willing to pay huge royalties to governments for accessing their genetic resources, and not realizing that actually a lot of the materials they use are in biobanks or internal pre-Nagoya, pre-CBD collections that they can screen. So, yeah, it doesn't seem, the CBD and Nagoya, the principles that they are trying to implement are commendable, but the implementation of a, it's a bilateral experiment that doesn't seem to have worked, and I don't see how a bilateral system could deliver benefits because it's fragmented and fractured and requires countries to be implementing at a national level, and the expense that has gone in implementing Nagoya, right? So each country developing legislation, developing monitoring systems, it's difficult to see how that could be workable. But I can imagine that would have been very difficult to foresee at the time that the CBD was approved, came into effect, negotiated and agreed, and likewise with Nagoya. I don't think people were realizing that the cost of sequencing would just fall so dramatically that not just the data that's out there, but the value, the actual analysis that you can be doing within these databases is leaps and bounds ahead of where it was 30 years ago. So I just think that, again, it's the pace of technological change just outpacing regulatory change.
Yeah, I mean, actually, his comment on that as well. So I think one of the problems is that species don't necessarily stick to boundaries that countries might want to compete with each other or might not want to have sovereign control over. As a neighbouring country, you can come along and that kind of stuff. But now the question I was going to ask is that, is there any legal precedent for kind of slightly disturbing concept that you could retrospectively put control over sequence access to things that have already been done? So to a certain extent, a lot of it's genie out of the bottle already. There are loads of sequences out there for a lot of species. Is there any precedent, for example, on copyright, of retrospectively adding that kind of control?
I'm not aware in an IP context of retrospective application of those kinds of rights. I mean, it does seem very particular to the ABS discussion, and the retrospective application is really around, what is utilization, and is a fresh use a utilization? I don't see comparable arguments in other IP or IP-like domains, but that's not to say that there aren't any either.
There's also that whole debate about what the origin of the plant is in the first place.
Yeah, and
I mean, in Australia we have this discussion of what's a native plant and what's introduced. I mean, there's a very blurry line there. So even then, do you control it? I just think that it's a very blurry thing.
Yeah, I think, I mean, from this lens, you could say that Nagoya has been a policy failure because from the outset, irrespective of the pace of, you couldn't anticipate certain technological advances, but making the lowest common denominator the organism, right? When you know that where already enough was understood about genetics to realize that there is conserved metabolic pathways, protein function, the organism is not the lowest common denominator in a scientific context. So it's almost like it was set up to, in that sense, it's like it was set up to fail. But that's also a failure of science policy, or actual policymakers being equipped to understand the science then existing to be able to create a system that's future-proof. And, very early on with Nagoya being implemented, there was, it became very obvious that it would lead to jurisdiction shopping, right? The same organism with a comparable set of genetics might be available somewhere else that is either not a signatory to either of these instruments, or that doesn't impose onerous requirements. And so I don't think you could say that should have been a surprise. It really shows a lack of understanding of basic science and maybe issues that should have really been anticipated. But there's a real disconnect sometimes between science policy and international regulatory policy, and this is exactly the what this open letter tries to hone in on is, you've learned from Nagoya that bilateral comes at a huge cost. Learn from that experience. And what's at stake? Well, look at, yes, okay, to some, the database infrastructure is a huge biopiracy machine. But at the same time, if we want to tackle climate change, if we want to tackle sustainability challenges, they're in other technologies. The technologies that will emerge to address these issues are in many ways dependent on this infrastructure. So be careful that trying to address one issue, you don't create all of these unintended consequences, or you don't rush. And that's the other real risk, that in the very limited time frame between now and December, some countries are saying that they will not adopt a global biodiversity framework without a solution on ABS. What happens at the 11th hour on the negotiation table, who knows? But there's a real risk that some compromises are made and some policy option is agreed, that then when it's fleshed out, it's full of contradictions or inconsistencies or unintended consequences. So we find ourselves not necessarily improving on Nagoya. That's the real concerning issue, and that's the glass half empty, right? The glass half full is that actually the policymakers are understanding these issues that are being raised by different organizations. Even the negotiators in their own countries would have ministries of science and innovation advising them, maybe think twice. That's what you hope, but obviously it's difficult to know. But we talked about cognitive dissonance and this trend towards open, and you look at the UNESCO recommendation on open science, and so how do those same countries then seem to be advocating bilateral and regulatory approaches to information that is part of open science? By the same token, many of these countries that are opposed have bio-innovation strategies that are, right, they're envisioning that in 20, 30 years they will have significant industries that depend on bio-innovation and have incorporated open access in their national bio-innovation strategies. So you hope that come negotiations in December, the governments, whatever cards they might be playing at the negotiating table, kind of at least understand and are being advised across the board on the implications for innovation as well as the implications for conservation and sustainable use. That these things aren't happening in silos. So glass half full.
Glass half full. I think, and of course we do have to remember that Nagoya was put forward as a way to try to protect, countries such as, Brazil and Fiji and so on. Perhaps we'll move on to the sort of the wrap-up section now, I think.
Sure. So which we've been doing in an indirect way. We've been talking about what's at stake from a bad deal or from no deal, and what a good deal could look like. So a multilateral system that has minimal impact on open access would be a good deal. Can we get there? That's the big question. We've talked about, I think everybody's before this, but you didn't need this workshop to already anticipate what the implications could be for open access if a bilateral type approach was suddenly to govern. If suddenly tomorrow you had some pop-up that you couldn't access the databases that you're using on a daily basis without registering or without paying a fee, it could, depending on your institution, depending on the country that your institution's in, have some significant consequences on your research. We've talked about the cognitive dissonance and the consequences if information that wants to be free is suddenly subject to all these frictions. It's not just basic research that suffers. It's our ability to respond, to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, our ability to respond to health and climate change challenges. So we've touched on those, and you've heard me, and some of us, but for those of you that haven't spoken, feel free to share your reflections either on how you think this might affect your research in and around Arabidopsis, how you see whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about a solution being found. Any thoughts you might have? So inviting reflections on that. And similarly, so we had thought 20 minutes, we're actually almost at 6, so we are almost at wrap-up time. So I think, any reflections? And otherwise, this question of cost, I don't think it's helpful to say that, well, you can't touch open access, it's too important, and that's also quite tone deaf to the the reason we're at this critical juncture is because there are, and the grand bargain is not working. So to not touch open access, what price, what cost would the scientific community be prepared to pay? So, and I
think there's a real danger of increasing inequity because we send out seed all over the world, and if people from particular countries make a case they can't afford it, we give it to them for free. And the way this is going, I don't see that same model would be used. So, for example, if somebody is in this country, they might find it relatively straightforward to pay to access sequence material. If you're in a country that is perhaps not as wealthy, you may not be able to access that. So access benefit sharing is actually, in this case, with sequence barriers, possibly going to lead towards less equity.
That's a really good point. Sorry, because I was thinking along the sort of software line. It used to be that all your apps and things were free, and now, well, you might have a free app, but you have to pay for the things in it. I guess you can get around those things with costs, but then it does become difficult with equity within particular countries. Different institutions can report things in different ways, and libraries, and we all send PDFs to our friends in other countries that can't access particular journals. Of course. Sorry, there's the editors here. So does anyone else here have any ideas? Is this all completely new to you, or is it something you've thought about? Yeah.
Sorry, I came in late, so my question might not be completely relevant. But I was just thinking, is that possible? I've been to Brazil recently. I was just impressed by the rich kind of diversity there, and I also heard from the local people there. Their government actually forbid any of the plant materials to be exported, which I think is really a great shame. But I wonder if we can protect the genetic information just like protecting IPs, intellectual properties. You still have disclose your invention, right? Everybody still knows the invention, but until you commercialize that invention, you have to pay for that IP. Can we do similar thing for genetic material? For example, the material is open, everybody see them, but until you use the material, for example, you made a new papaya, out of these the materials from Brazil, then you have to really make them benefit as well, help them to preserve the Amazon kind of forest as well. The Brazil people will see a benefit of preserving that biodiversity. It's a win-win situation, isn't it?
That's a really interesting idea. Catherine?
I guess I'd say, the big drawback to that is, what if you use sequences from lots of countries in a comparative analysis to work out what that gene does, but then you go and just use one from, some crop that isn't subject to this, and so you've gained all that benefit of all those sequences, but you're not directly using it. And I think that seems to be one of the problems.
Yeah, I think there's lots of clever ways around things. I work on sorghum, which is a long way from Arabidopsis, but I work on all the Australian native species, and we're just sequencing them all, and thank goodness we're finding they all actually are sorghum, because we're a bit worried they might go into a different genus, and then it would be covered by these protocols, which is, we're smart people. So what about you? Have you thought about this? Any comments or thoughts, or how would you like to see you can contribute?
We say clever people get around things. It's not impossible to have access to sequence that you could synthesize something that is a mix of SNPs, and it has to origin. So who do you pay?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've got European colleagues that work in the far-flung French territories because they're actually EU. So you can study tropical plants in New Caledonia and Réunion, and that's actually classified as EU, and so they don't have to worry. So, I mean, these are sort of not ideal situations because you want people to get the benefit. In terms of how you can help with us, I might pass you over to Isabel to give just a few comments because we're putting together some things. We did, as a Global Plant Council, sign that letter. The first page is fantastic. There is some little stuff buried on page 2 or 3 that we're perhaps not quite so sure about that was pointed out to us later. So you do need to be aware of the small print sometimes when you sign things.
So Rodrigo, can you put on the slide where our resources please appear? So regarding our working group and here. So we have not only a working group, a working group that actually meets and organizes workshops like this one, and we have another workshop coming on in a couple of weeks in Montpellier. If you want to come, you're all invited and welcome there. But also we have put together some resources. We haven't created them yet, but it's another plan that will come, hopefully during this year after this workshop, and the next one we will put together a policy paper with our thoughts, or the thoughts that have been coming up in the different meetings and different workshops. And then if you want to go deeper into DSI, ABS, and the whole thing, that it's massive and very challenging, as Rodrigo has already very well explained. We have pick and choose a couple of them that are quite perfect for introducing yourself. And if you know nothing, you will end up knowing something. So, and it won't be as challenging as going in directly in a more law-based, case-by-case scenario. So it's and also we are welcome if you have also ideas to be included there. It's an open page. That means that if there's my email available in the page, you can send me your resources that you have found, or put together, and I will include them there. So.
Thanks, Isabel. Yeah, so there's the resources page, which is growing. I just had an idea then to get a broader sense of the community. Would it be, and this is a question, we could set something up, and like an open page where you could submit things on our website, where you just type something in a box, you don't have to put your name on it, just send it in with what you think or what you'd like to know. Would that be useful, or do you think anyone would do it? Or we can just do it by email? I'm just thinking if we had some sort of, there may be a way, we just want to capture this. The other thing we've thought about is that we've got several people who are editors of journals on the board at the moment, and we are wondering whether we could even write some comment thing that could be published broadly across simultaneously in a number of journals, just something like a one-pager or something, just to draw attention to this. So if there's no other questions, I think it's time to, I'll turn this off because I've got feedback. I just want to thank Rodrigo for coming, giving his time, giving us I have a much better handle on what's going on and this tension between the different solutions of bilateral, multilateral. It's actually starting to make sense. I chair the working group, so there you go. I said I wouldn't, but I am. So look, I really want to thank you for giving that time. I think it's a conversation that we're starting. There's not a lot of people here. That's because they really don't know what would happen if they couldn't access those databases to do those gene networks. You would be, I'm trying to think of a word that a non-Australian would use. I can't think of one. Okay, so I think that this is something that we really do need to spread the word, and that's what this is about. So thank you very much for coming, and we really appreciate it. And